right, cool. Well, let's officially get started. So welcome everyone to Save Democracy, Save the World, a panel discussion series hosted by the Hillsborough Democrats, where we take a view of the big picture surrounding the issues of our democracy and then zoom in to our own communities and what we can do here on the ground level. Volume 1 tonight is being co-hosted by Our Revolution Hillsborough, Our Revolution Somerset, and Common Cause. My name is Chris Crapello. I am the vice chairperson of the Hillsborough Democratic Organization and co-founder of Our Revolution Hillsborough. Our producer this evening is Jim Lavranchuk, and our moderators in the Facebook and YouTube chats are Didier Jimenez and Erin Norbury. Please feel free to submit any questions you have for our panelists through either of those chats, and we'll try to fit them into the discussion for you. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on money in politics. The problem of money in politics is very broad and encompasses everything from political campaign contributions and lobbying to PAC and super PAC and dark money spending groups to billionaire and industry funded policy think tanks and even contributions to colleges to influence curriculum. Today, we're going to be focusing on campaign finance. What are the problems with our donor-driven political system? How far back does this problem actually go? How does it impact every other major problem that we care about? What is being done to combat this problem, and what can we do in our own communities and in our own lives to bring about the change we need to see? Tonight, I'm honored to be joined by three amazing guests that each have their own unique experiences and knowledge bases on this issue, and I want to get right to them. So without further ado, he is a writer, a researcher, an organizer, working to build democracy that represents and empowers all voices in society. His research has focused on campaign finance, voting rights, and election policy, and his articles have been featured in the Washington Post, The Hill, The Nation, The New Republic, and in These Times. He is the current campaigns manager for Equal Citizens, a nonpartisan pro-democracy organization founded by Professor Lawrence Lessig, and is the co-author, along with Francis Moore, of my own personal Bible over the last couple of years, Daring Democracy. Get this book. Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Adam Eichen.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here, man. Can you give us just like a brief background as to the work that you do and how you came about it, how you got into it?
Well, the story of how I got into this work is really, to be honest, it was an accident. I was in college. I was really politically involved. I got really depressed, just because there were so many different things that I wanted to change about the world. I mean, not a huge surprise, right? It feels like on every single issue we're facing a crisis and that things are not working the way they should be in a moral and just way. And it was actually through an organization called Democracy Matters, which organizes college students to fight for democracy reform, but specifically money in politics, that I got thinking about these issues of how democracy intersects with all the other issues that I cared so deeply about. And so I found actually a real sense of passion and dedication to the issue of democracy when I realized that I actually could fight for all of the different progressive things that I cared so deeply about, but I just had to focus on democracy first, because money in politics, voting rights, gerrymandering, all of these things is what was preventing progress on these progressive issues. And so once that kind of clicked for me, it just developed a lifelong passion and interest in democracy reform. And in college, I was kind of known as this nerd who focused on democracy issues. And I know it's probably not surprising to anybody watching this. It wasn't that long ago that I was in college. It was about 5 years ago, but this took place, about 7, 8 years ago. And, in recent years, it's become a little bit sexier to focus on democracy issues now that everyone is seemingly in consensus that our democracy is falling apart and that money in politics has far too big an influence in DC and in state houses across the country. But, once that clicked, and we're going to talk about that a lot tonight, if once you have that moment that you realize that, we can't make progress on climate change legislation, we can't ensure a livable wage, we can't ensure a country that can actually address the stain of racial injustice, that we can actually have an inclusive country that treats everyone equally. We can't have those things until we unrig our democracy. that's when we can begin to move forward. And so I'm really excited to talk about that, because that was my entry point. And I've been across the country speaking to many, many people, and every day people are having that realization, and slowly but surely there's a growing movement of people who are fighting for reform, not because it's the most important issue, but because it's the first issue.
Yep, exactly. And speaking of reform, she is the former Deputy General Counsel for New York City's Campaign Finance Board, founding director and architect of Connecticut's Citizens Election Program, which is actually discussed in Daring Democracy as a shining example of how good things happen when clean money elections are put in place. She's the current Money in Politics and Ethics Program Director for Common Cause. And oh yeah, she clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Second Circuit for none other than future Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. What? Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to Ms. Beth Rotman.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. I'll tell you that Judge Sotomayor is actually the reason that I understood how important it is to do this work, because she was a mentor of mine, and when I knew I wanted to be a public interest attorney, I was clerking, and I was looking at different opportunities. I knew a little bit about public financing, but not a ton. And when one of the opportunities was the New York City Campaign Finance Board, the judge got really excited and actually jumped up and said, "Oh my God, I used to be on their board, and this is an amazing organization, and you should talk to them." And I learned a ton about it, went there, got the job, and went on to really learn as a sort of baby attorney in this very well-established public financing program in New York City that's been around now 30 years, that public financing is really the change that makes every other change possible. And after working my way up there and becoming the Deputy General Counsel, I was watching and helping the extraordinary things that were happening in Connecticut, and watching all of the amazing advocates who were fighting and organizing Common Cause and many, many others to pass reform after Governor Rowland went to jail for accepting bribes, and there was already a treasurer in jail for, among other things, corruption, gold bars in the backyard, the kind of stories you can't make up.
Wow.
And it was an incredible period of reform passing, and I think that after many, many people were so excited to understandably pass the reform, that's the part where I came in. And that was where sort of my hard work starts, because I've built up this expertise in actually implementing these programs, coming out of an established program in New York City and then building the infrastructure for Connecticut. Because even once reforms pass, they have to be run well. Otherwise, you can end up having a scandal, and this time with public money. So I'm really honored to be part of that success story, but it really, it's a time where we see that these established public financing programs have a lot of lessons, and that the activism we're seeing on the ground can meet those lessons in a really great place and hopefully spread like the wildfire that we need.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, he is the head of communications and public outreach at Princeton University's Plasma Physics Laboratory. He has a master's and PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University and was elected to the New Jersey Assembly in 2015, with the Courier News calling him, quote, "one of the most promising political faces to appear in the region in many years." As Assemblyman, he has authored and co-sponsored A1200, a ranked choice voting bill, and Bill S-150, which fought to curtail the influence of dark money in New Jersey politics. He went from questions of dark energy and dark matter to dark money. We'll find out about that transition. Ladies and gentlemen, one of our two intrepid assemblymen here in New Jersey's 16th District, Dr. Andrew Zwicker.
Thank you, Chris. It's a very kind and warm welcome. And I'm fortunate enough to represent the 16th District in the New Jersey General Assembly, along with Hillsborough's own Assemblyman Roy Fryman.
Yes.
you know, I guess I have to start, before I move to politics or money, I have to start with science. Just to be clear, I'm a plasma physicist / fusion energy person, not a dark matter, dark energy person.
It's all the
So
same thing.
I'll avoid the lecture and the PowerPoint slides I have queued up ready to go on
Another night.
New source of energy.
We'll bring you back.
So I'll just simply say to kick off my part of the discussion, a couple of things. One, I was very fortunate and deeply honored. So I've been in the New Jersey legislature since January of 2016 and won the election in November of 2015. And for those of you who are watching, who may not be part of New Jersey's politics, we run our state elections in odd years. So while we have a presidential and United States Senate and Congress coming up, we run the state legislature in between. So in 2015, about 34,000 people came out to vote that year in my district, and I won by 78 votes. So first point of optimism is every vote matters. And part of why I won, at least as best we can tell, is because of my science background, is because in general, I would say people are really frustrated by this enormous partisan divide. And whether you are a Democrat as I am, whether you are an unaffiliated independent voter, whether you are someone who is a moderate Republican, who in the end, we may have differences of opinion on the size and role of government, but this idea of using actual facts, well before we got to this absurdity of alternative facts, or that I have been to, I think it's 3 marches for science, where I've had to stand in front of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people and say, I believe in science. And that's an absurd thing to say. Science doesn't care what we believe science is. It's up to us to understand it. So number one is every vote matters. Another thing I'll just say about it is there is hope. I was outspent in my election of 2015 by about 2.6 to 1. And so while it is true that in the vast majority of time that the candidate with more money, wherever that money may come from, and I'm sure we'll unpack some of that, wins, in my case, that wasn't actually what happened. And so I think, you know, there is also optimism that we can get some things done, and that messaging matters, and that, you know, there are ways as we figure out how to get a better democracy that truly represents all people to still go after social justice, racial justice, climate change, global warming, environmental protection, workers' rights, whatever you may want to put onto that agenda. And then, yeah, you know, I sort of have 3 buckets. I'll finish it up this way. One of that I work on legislatively, 3 buckets I work on legislatively. One is, how can science, technology, and innovation be used as a job creator, as an economic driver, and make sure that we don't leave people behind? Second is, as I mentioned, global warming, climate change. You know, and what can I do? Well, that's a global problem, and the United States has lost its role as a leader globally. What can I do as a state legislator to make sure, at least within New Jersey, we have clean air, clean water, clean land? And then finally is, what do you want to call it? Voting rights, democracy, reform, et cetera. But the point of tonight, but, you know, dark money, and how do we get rid of unlimited amounts of money that isn't, no one has to report out. You mentioned ranked choice voting, and I've done this whole series of other things that I've sponsored around this whole thing. So I use that to just say it's really a pleasure for me to join Adam and Beth in this conversation, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course, it's absolutely an honor to have all 3 of you once again. To kind of start to get into the meat and potatoes of everything, Adam, I'd like to ask you, your book does a really great summation of the history of this issue, and it sums it up in what's called the anti-democracy movement, or the anti-democracy forces, I believe. How far back does this problem actually go? Because a lot of people just equate it to Citizens United and they think everything kind of fell apart after that, whereas it's actually been with us for a much longer time.
Right, and I think that's a great way to start this off, and I really appreciate that you're framing it that way, because I agree that I often, will say that Citizens United, which most people at least have some vague awareness of, the 2010 Supreme Court case that allowed corporations and unions to spend directly from their treasuries on independent expenditures, so things that are not affiliated directly with a campaign, that was really the start of this problem of campaign financing. It certainly made campaign finance salient in the public mind, but 2010 is not the beginning of when money in politics captured Washington and state houses across the country. I mean, we could go back as far as the beginning of corporate personhood. We could go back even before then. Constitutional scholar Zephyr Teachout, wrote a book on corruption in America that goes all the way back in terms of the different influences that have tried to capture state houses in Washington, D.C. throughout American history. But in our book, Francis Moore Lepay and I really track the beginning of something different to 1971, when a soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, about 2 months before he was confirmed, wrote a secret memo to the Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest business lobby, and back then was still very large, but less so, making the case that the business interests, the corporate titans, needed to get involved in politics, because it seems absurd today to think that at one point corporations weren't putting a stranglehold on politicians across the country, but it was largely true. You think back to the 1960s, the late 1960s. I obviously wasn't alive then, but that was a time when you have a flourishing of democracy in a very imperfect way, a never perfect way, but you do have previously oppressed, marginalized groups making claims upon government. You think of the civil rights movement, you think of the birth of the women's liberation movement, the anti-war movement, the beginning of the environmental movement. You have the consumer protection movement led by Ralph Nader. And all of these forces of previously marginalized groups are making claims upon government and largely winning. Not fully, of course, but certainly government was more responsive to people's interests, the common good. We had the war on poverty, we had a lot of different things. And of course, this was in the context of the New Deal, which radically transformed government and how we spend money. So Powell writes this memo to the Chamber of Commerce, and it gets circulated around to some of the largest businesses and the CEOs of those businesses. And essentially what we outline in the book, and this is really outlined, I think, most beautifully, and I'm indebted completely to Jane Mayer, the writer of The New Yorker, who wrote a book, Dark Money, that really is where we drew most of these links from, because she's the investigative journalist. We just tried to put it into a more summation. And over the course of kind of post-1971 America, you see slowly but surely a long-term, deliberate, well-funded effort to engage in kind of two simultaneous campaigns, both manipulating the way Americans think, so promoting academics, chairships at universities, monitoring textbooks, getting rid of the fairness doctrine in media, propping up media sites and organizations that are promoting relatively fringe views, taking these anti-public stances, anti-public good stances, right? Because ultimately this was a movement to try and chip away at any sort of government, to denigrate it, to make us no longer believe in government, but then also to rig the rules in a certain way, to fight against campaign finance restrictions, to fight against the right to vote, to increase lobbying expenditures. I mean, I believe it was in the 11 years after Powell wrote his memo, the number of corporations, the number of firms with lobbyists went up, I think, about 14-fold. And so you see this really steady trajectory, kind of almost exponential, of kind of the ushering of resources, the marshaling of resources to begin to have more influence in Washington, D.C. And again, this is a really important point in state houses across the country. This is not just a DC or nothing thing. This is really trying to shape American politics from all the way at the bottom of the local elections to the top all the way to the presidency. And it sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory, but it's all public record at this point, and it's very, very clear. And not, a lot of the people involved in it weren't exactly secret about it. I think about Paul Weyrich, one of the leading people in this anti-democracy movement, who essentially said at a conference in 1980 that we don't want everyone to vote, that our power, frankly, goes up as fewer people vote. And that's kind of the mindset of this. You see it when the Koch brothers were running the Libertarian Party. David Koch ran for president, the vice presidential candidate in the Libertarian Party in 1980. And you see the things that were in his platform, and they couldn't do it that way, but they just kept funding and funding slowly but surely to get their views out into the open and to get rid of, money in politics regulations. And so obviously, it's hard to articulate all of that in a short little bit of time. But the key takeaway is that, none of this happened overnight. And kind of by proxy of that, this is a process that's been started a long time ago. And it took a very long time to really develop the, judicial infrastructure to be even arguing in front of the Supreme Court that money in politics regulations were a violation of the First Amendment. And I should say that the real critical Supreme Court case that even allowed for this potential, or the Citizens United, was Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, which, Beth, you seem as a lawyer, you're the one to talk about that. But that clearly was the case that differentiated different types of spending and was the real root of what we see today, especially with independent expenditures. And so you just it's so frustrating in some respects that the problem of money in politics and democracy more broadly is framed as a recent fight. But as we know, all of American history is the struggle over democracy and who can participate, from the nation's founding and before all the way today. And what we see, especially in the last 50 years, is really just another chapter of that larger book of American democracy. And so, I'm happy to take questions on that, but I think that's the key framing point here, is that none of the issues that we're facing today came out of the blue in the last decade, but it was a long, deliberate, well-funded effort, and our response has to be equally deliberate, long-term, and will never be quite as well-funded, but it has to be adequately funded to keep doing the work that folks at Common Cause and all the other amazing democracy reform organizations across the country are doing. Because this isn't, it didn't change overnight, and it's also not going to change back or forward overnight either.
No, that's very true, and I'm happy that you brought it up in the terms of that democracy is a journey in and of itself. It's not a destination, right?
Exactly.
And in thinking that, Beth, you and I have talked previously about how money in politics has impacted, it's literally every single issue. We've kind of said that already today, climate change, public health. Most pressingly, we've seen recently are the response to the COVID pandemic and criminal justice system. How has money in politics touched these sort of individual issues, and why should people be thinking whenever they see something on the news, they need to start thinking in terms of the sort of underlying problem of money in politics that is underneath all of these issues that we see coming at us?
Well, thank you, Chris. I think it's a great question. One of the things that we talk about at Common Cause, particularly when we have our governing board meetings, is this question of kitchen table issues. What are everyday Americans talking about at their kitchen table? And we, as an organization that focuses on structural democracy, even just the phrase structural democracy, you tend to assume, well, it may not be structural democracy. That may be, the cost of food. It may be any number of other things, education, roads. But you don't automatically think that everyday Americans are sitting around their kitchen table and talking about public financing, citizens-funded elections, lobbyists, and the like. But the reality is that our issues, these sort of how campaigns are funded, who has the ear of our elected leaders, who's able to be elected, who's making those decisions about what's important and where our government resources go, and on and on and on, impacts every kitchen table issue that we have, which is why it's really, and I didn't make this up. Gene Rushinoff was the first one I heard say it, and he's amazing and from the New York Public Interest Research Group. But I always hear him say public financing is the change that makes every other change possible. And so we try to connect the structural democracy issues like citizen-funded elections to the issues like right now, who are the service workers with healthcare, for example. And we found that the service workers with healthcare, one of the states to be the first to pass more sweeping reforms was the state of Connecticut. And we partly found that because we were looking to see whether these reforms, citizen-funded elections and others, actually led to better government. Because there has been a lot of research on the question of whether these reforms lead to more people being able to be elected to office, whether people can be elected to office with money from real people, small dollar contributions, but a bit less on, because it's difficult to prove, sort of better government. Less focus on whether government itself actually changes and passes and whether we actually get better laws. And so that's been one of the focuses of my work lately, and our work at Common Cause, is how are we connected to kitchen table issues, and are we really giving people sort of better government when they pass these reforms? And I think that I have to be honest, I'm an optimistic person and I believe in these reforms. It's been my entire career. But when I started asking these questions, I was prepared for sort of more moderate responses. I was ready to hear even reformers say to me that I was pushed, well, maybe you can't really prove it. But the response, the answers so far have been extraordinary. I spent a few weeks in Connecticut recently looking at what has passed and talking to lobbyists, even from before the laws and after the laws, and talking to people who've been in office a long time and people who are recently in office. I was shocked. And I was the original person running the program. So it's not that I was hoping to hear, bad things. I was floored. I mean, even the way that people lobbying hasn't gone out of business in Connecticut, but the lobbyists will tell you now in the state of Connecticut, which has full public financing, and it's been fully implemented now for 10 years, that it's a real discussion of policy on the merits. And it's not about what it used to be, which was whether the lobbyists could raise $20,000 from their clients or whatever the price tag was on the legislation that they needed passed. And I know that sounds illegal, but the reality is that it's not actually illegal to have conversations about the giving power of your clients, which is what was happening. But it was also understood that in exchange, and I don't think anybody had to say it, for raising those $20,000 checks, that when that lobbyist found you in the hallway as you were passing the budget implementer like clockwork at the end of every session, that there were going to be some favors. And things that didn't seem like big deals at the time, but that over a long period of time, one bill in particular cost the Connecticut taxpayers $25 million a year. And the first year after sweeping public financing passed, that bill actually finally went against the lobbyists and has brought $250 million back to the state. So I even add that even more shocking than all of the sort of amazing findings about better policy, it's actually also saved quite a bit of money, and that's just one bill. So, I mean, this really is the change that makes every other change possible.
That's great. I'd like to point out that it's not an individual politician problem. Looking at Assemblyman Zwicker, it is a systemic problem. That's what we're talking about here. When we talk about this issue, and you hear specific giving by or to anyone, we're really more talking about this is a problem of the entire system, a system in which President Jimmy Carter himself said that, and I'm paraphrasing, the United States is no longer a democracy, but an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. It's not the fault of any single one person, but it is the way that our structure is set up. And I'd like to go to Assemblyman Zwicker now to kind of get your take on just the ongoing sort of drudging that is having to raise money in this sort of political landscape, how that affects your work, and kind of how you've seen money in politics play out on the stage of the New Jersey government.
Wow. Okay. I mean, and also
There's
talking after Adam and Beth, there's just so much to unpack. And I'm just sort of struggling with where to go with everything that has been raised so far. You know, I don't want in any way to minimize the role of money in politics, the influence of money in politics, or anything that either Adam or Beth said. I would, you know, this is such a tough one because I don't know the details of what happened in Connecticut, but we don't have public financing in New Jersey, which isn't to say I do think it's a good idea, but we've also passed a lot of what would be considered very progressive bills. And so, you know, the scientist in me is sort of struggling with, you know, the systemic issues versus the particulars right now. And then I could tie that into my own experiences over the last 4.5 years in and out of the State House in Trenton. So I don't think it's that simple. I mean, but at the same time, I just want to make it clear, I'm not discounting the influence of money or the systemic problems, but there's a lot of things that are going on and are going into creating a piece of legislation or amending a piece of legislation. And this, you know, idea that a lobbyist will just come in and raise money and then say, I need you to amend this bill for me. Of course that happens, but that's not what happens on a day-to-day basis, I guess, at least not in my experience. And I'm just one person, right? So I push back on that at a certain level and open this up in many different ways because there's so much that goes into a piece of legislation, so many influences. I think the key question is really, you know, people are not voting. And so, you know, and I think Beth is alluding to it in ways when she's talking about the legislation in Connecticut, but people aren't voting. And then people aren't necessarily voting people out who don't represent their values. So there's other things that go into, you know, what is it that influences a particular legislator? And finally, I'll say, look, you know, I don't think there's an elected official who's ever enjoyed making phone calls to raise money. But, you know, to raise money from individuals is a piece of this whole imperfect democratic process. You know, and is, again, I'm not trying to say there isn't money coming out of whether it's a lobbyist or a union or an organization or whatever it might be. But, it, you know, the real question is, and I'll throw this back to Beth, I suppose, is it public financing as the solution? Is it utter and complete transparency? In other words, you know, because the question with public financing will be public financing without dark money reform. You know, you'll have to explain whether that's sufficient on its own. You know, is it, and I'd be curious to either of you, for instance, do we just go fully transparent? Some people have suggested get rid of limits of individuals, for instance, but make everything transparent. I have to report out everything that I take in over $299, right? Regardless, it's all public. But, you know, should we try to get rid of dark money somehow and then make it all completely open and transparent? I don't know the answer to that. You know, you look back historically, et cetera. But I do think things are so complicated. And the key is the end result, which is giving the power back to the people, you know, to get things done.
Beth, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll just share that. I should back up a bit and say that I don't mean at all to imply that even in Connecticut, there were many lawmakers who, were voting their conscience and not doing it about the $20,000 checks. But that was an extreme example of a system that required lawmakers to spend an incredible amount of their time raising money, which meant they had to spend a lot of their time listening to people who could either help them do that or write big checks. And one of the things that I've heard that I think makes a big difference in leading to better government is the opportunity for lawmakers to feel like they have the real opportunity to listen more generally to more people without having that sort of onus of dialing for dollars as a major part of their lives. And we've heard it on the other side from people who have been a part of policy making in these jurisdictions that they have felt more listened to after the passing of these laws, because they felt that they had a better chance of getting their, GMO restriction bill sort of listened to in a more open setting, without feeling like they were going up against a big industry with at least the appearance, because we talk about the appearance of special interest influence and corruption in this kind of world a lot more than actual corruption. We have laws against bribery and the sort of actual corruption stuff, but we're really talking about whether people feel empowered. And then you have a whole other group of really smart researchers. Michael Malvin is one of them, from the National Institute of Money and Politics, that talk about how when people are able to give small dollar contributions, it may lead them to it would make them feel more connected to their democracy and make them more likely to vote. So I think that the reason that public financing, but I don't think it's the only thing. And I think that you raised a great point, which is that the disclosure reforms and the need for transparency and the idea of sort of reasonable contribution limits, these are all things that contribute to a sort of fairer system. But I think the idea of empowering the everyday Americans to feel that their small dollar contribution actually has a role in the elections, and even if they give $5, that's something that actually matters, has been shown to make it more likely that people will participate in other ways, including voting.
So I just want to hop in quickly, and I appreciate the questions, and Beth, I agree with everything you just said. And I think that the one point I want to kind of bring out a little bit more is that I think most people think of kind of the campaign finance, the money and politics stuff as a quid pro quo, as kind of a, we're giving to you, you give something back to us. And that's clearly, part of this. And some of it is implicit, some of it is explicit, and in those cases of explicit quid pro quo, it is illegal and people have been thrown in jail. But I think that the real part is in the dialing for dollars and the fundraising, is it's a socializing process, right? That when you spend all of your time, it depends on the state, right? In some states you have to raise a lot more versus others, but especially in Congress, you're expected to spend the majority of your day, up to 70% of your time, according to a leaked document from 2014, I believe, up to 70% of your time fundraising. Right? And when you spend your days talking to the donors you can max out, because if you're running for Congress, you're not actually soliciting $5, $10, $50 donations. You're looking for maxed out donors. And when you spend all your time talking to those donors, trying to work your magic, you begin to, as my boss, my colleague, Lawrence Lessig, will say in his talks, you begin to lean to the green. And he's not talking about the Green New Deal. He's talking about you're leaning towards the positions, the slogans, the mannerisms to get you that maxed out check. And that's not nefarious in the sense of it's not you doing something that is necessarily even you're fully aware of. but you begin to be socialized when you're talking to a bunch of bankers in Greenwich, Connecticut, or on Wall Street, or wherever it is. You begin to develop a sixth sense of what those people want to hear. And John Sarbanes, who is the architect of the big public financing proposal in Congress that was morphed into this amazing democracy reform package called HR1, the For the People Act, he has this great metaphor or kind of way to talk about this, that if you're a member of Congress and you've been fundraising from people working in investment banks, and talking to them, and they say, well, it wouldn't really affect me to raise the age of Social Security. You'd have a very different perspective if you spent 70% of your time talking to someone in the Amazon factory, lifting boxes, about what the difference between 1 year of age of Social Security eligibility would be, right? And so I agree, the system is significantly more complex than anything quid pro quo, but ultimately it comes down to where are the incentives in the system? And right now, the incentives in a non-public financing election go to raising money. And it's not necessarily any individual legislature who's doing anything wrong, although certainly there are some things, but it's the system. You have to run, if you want to run for office, you have to raise money, period. Like the DCCC won't take you seriously if you can't raise, I don't know, 300 grand a week, or maybe not quite that much, but I mean, that's what's considered a legitimate candidate. So it's not just about kind of the outcomes, but it's also, who does that disadvantage? Well, if you're a person of color, if you're a young person, if you're generally, if you're a woman, it's much harder to have access to the old boys wealthy club of funders. So you're not going to be considered a legitimate contender. That's changing slightly, but there's still exceptions, not the rule. And moreover, to the point about do we just get rid of restrictions and make it all transparent, most Americans can't give. They don't have discretionary income. Something like 40% of Americans, or maybe I don't know the exact number, but a large majority of Americans can't have a $400 or couldn't pay off a $400 unexpected expense. Especially during this pandemic, it shouldn't be the responsibility of to get access, to get that socialization, you shouldn't have to pay up because most Americans can't. The number of people contributing in federal and state elections is still a fraction of the overall population, which is why the public financing is so critical, because you can't say the word equalizing because the Supreme Court will slap you on the wrist, but you can say that it's certainly a way to ensure that every voice can be heard. Maybe every voice won't be equal, because I agree the outside money is a clear problem, and it's certainly the biggest problem facing public financing systems. But then you also see a system like Seattle, which Chris, I know you want to talk about, where every voter gets 4 $25 vouchers, basically free money to give to eligible local candidates. Those candidates were able to withstand the independent expenditures. And in the process, as Beth was saying, when they were going around collecting money from, people who are experiencing homelessness or low-income housing, you see that those people began to feel invested in politics for the very first time. And so I agree, we have to think of like these reforms as part of a larger toolbox of reforms. And I think if we pursue all of them, we can have a system that is significantly more equal, that at least treats citizens equally in the United States. But I think this discussion is incredibly worthwhile.
So I want to try to get, we have just a little bit of time left. I kind of want to get into specific talk over what we can do in our local communities to further this fight, essentially, this fight for democracy, this journey. I would like to be able to see public financing on local levels everywhere, in local municipalities. Beth, what would something like that look like to a small community like, say, in Hillsborough, where it's only maybe 30, 40,000 people, but especially in a community such as this, you don't really develop a local donor base, and yet your local elections every single year cost anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000. You end up raising the majority of the money, and I'm speaking from personal experience on a couple of campaigns now in the local area, you end up raising most of the money from outside of the community. So what would like a public financing ordinance look like at a local level here? And then what kind of would be the steps to take to arrive at one?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I'll tell you that one of the things that I think is also another benefit of public financing is that you start to see more people giving from in the jurisdiction. It's typically a requirement that you raise some small dollar contributions from people that you would actually represent, and then that those funds are either matched or like in New York City, or you get a full grant like in Connecticut from the state. So you actually have to go out and talk to people that you hope to represent and convince them why they should give you $5. Or in some places like Connecticut, it's between $5 and $100. But either way, you have to get these smallish dollar contributions, and that also makes a difference. But I'll say that the truth is there's not a one-size-fits-all. You can have a voucher program like you have in Seattle. You can have a matching funds program like we have in New York City and many, many other places now. You can have a full public financing system like we have in Connecticut, which means you get a large grant from the state. The key is making sure that the public financing gives people a decent amount of money so they can run a competitive race. I will tell you that while independent expenditures have definitely been an issue, it's always still an issue that it used to be that you could get additional public money if you were targeted by independent expenditures. When I worked in New York City years ago, we used to give a supplemental grant for that. The same thing with the first run in 2008 in Connecticut, but then that got struck down right around the same time as Citizens United. The US Supreme Court struck that down, saying you cannot give publicly financed candidates additional money when they're targeted by independent expenditures. It is an issue, but I will tell you that if you give competitive grants, more people are able to run for office, and you know the numbers. You know what kind of money is needed, because it's important to have people like you, Chris, who understand how to run competitive campaigns, involved in the process of working on these laws. And then there's a whole network of people from everybody on this call, but also people around the country who've been a part of programs that used to be sort of Maine, Arizona, Connecticut, New York City, Los Angeles, and now, wow, I mean, now it's like particularly municipal programs have cropped up, all across the country. In the past decade, it's been phenomenal. So there are lots of models, lots of people that'll help you find the program that fits you. And then it's about doing, I think, also what Adam talked about earlier, which is working with people on the ground who are excited about democracy and change, and bringing sort of the policy geeks together with the people on the ground who want to impact change in their own home, and watching the great things happen. I think that's what happened in Connecticut and what's been happening all around the country, particularly over the past decade, where these programs are popping up in municipalities all over. And it can happen to you, Chris.
Thanks. Yeah. Oh, I mean, would possibly Beth Rotman and Common Cause be interested in working with some punchy local activists in the New Jersey suburban area on possibly crafting such an ordinance?
We would love to. And in fact, one of the other members of the team at Common Cause reminded me the other day that she was in New Jersey. She's a New Jerseyite, and she was part of passing some of the early pilots that you had there. So we even have some New Jersey roots that are in the office next door in National Common Cause. We'd be very happy to help.
Oh, that's excellent. And it also helps to have such a great ally in the State House in Assemblyman Zwicker as well. Assemblyman, could you talk about your bills with dark money and your most recent one with ranked choice voting, and then what your kind of goals for these bills were? I mean, obviously the dark money met some resistance from the very dark money groups you were trying to stop from doing what they were doing, but you can explain that better than I can.
Sure. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
We got it passed. We got it signed by the governor, and then it was taken to court where it was struck down. But we haven't given up. So the dark money, I'll be very brief. The idea is to try to make sure that large donations, so not you or I saying, I want to give $25 or $100 to some organization that represents the values that I share, but to these organizations that crop up with really the only purpose is to influence our elections, influence our laws, or influence our regulations. And so the idea was that we were going, and we did, say, we were requiring, that's why I brought up transparency before, full disclosure of these large donations going into these dark money groups. And, you know, that's been around for a while. It's been a big fight. It was a political fight. It was a fight among these various groups, right? Because everybody, I forget who said this first, but everybody's for transparency until they're asked to be transparent. And then all of a sudden, you know, that's the, oh my goodness, you know, I'm one of the good people. I couldn't tell you how many times I heard this. I'm one of the good people. I don't need to be transparent. It's that group over there. They need to be the ones who are transparent. So we did get it done. And I won't go into all of the weeds about what was the basis of the lawsuit, but before COVID-19 hit, we were queued up. So the bill was passed last year, taken to court immediately. It took a few months. We lost. But we knew where the Koch brother funded folks, but also the ACLU, which I often find myself mostly aligned with, was part of the lawsuit. As were these other dark money groups of environmental groups, and I'm one of the highest rated state, people in the New Jersey State Legislature, all didn't want to disclose. So we are, I'll just say that we are queued up, and we were queued up to address the state constitutional issue that the judge agreed with in the lawsuit. So that's one, and we are going back to it. We are not giving up. The last 3.5 months, because of the global health pandemic, has gotten us a little bit off track with this, but we haven't given up, and we're coming right back at it, and we're coming back stronger than ever, because if we can do it once, we're going to do it again. And that's just not open talk. I mean, we're going for it in the legislature, and and the governor will support this. In terms of, Chris, what did you say? Oh, and ranked choice voting I introduced that last year, and we've been really, the grassroots organization around ranked choice voting has been just phenomenal. And I will give the 10-second quick overview for those who don't know, but that is this idea that you have to get to a majority, that you can't just have someone come in with a small number of votes when you have a competitive election. And in ranked choice, you get to vote for them all in your order of preference. And so what it does is start to say, you don't have to be just Democrat or Republican or Green or whatever else it may be. You rank them all. And the one at the bottom, those votes, when that person comes in last, your second, if you voted for that person first, then your second choice, you get all your votes added there. It has been shown in where it's being used to, just like we're talking about with public financing, increase voter turnout, decrease negative campaigning as well. It's all positive stuff. And so we're coming back towards that too. It's part of this whole, as both Adam and Beth said, there are many different pieces of this, but how do we in the end get people to vote, be engaged, interacting with their elected officials, making sure that their voice is being heard? And so, yeah, it's complex, but I agree, whether it's public financing and removing some of this, whether it's transparency and going after dark money, or whether it is, making sure that you can choose, it doesn't always have to be so black and white. So we're coming back at it as we here in New Jersey, start to go from the immediate crisis around the pandemic and a health crisis to an economic crisis. Both of these are still front and center, but we are starting to slowly also come back to other issues. And the last thing I'll say is New Jersey's primary is a couple of weeks away, and sort of off topic but related is mail-in ballots, which has been in the news continually. And I have legislation that will get a hearing on Friday to try to make sure we don't disenfranchise people, that those who are choosing to vote, and we know come this November, we expect to see a turnout like we haven't seen before because of what's happened in Washington. Making sure that voting is as easy as possible, as secure as possible, and that, again, you have a way to make sure that your vote really does count. And so that's another piece that we didn't get to the details, but it's going to be critically important. We're going to see it in New Jersey. We've seen a disaster in Georgia. We saw a disaster in Wisconsin. We have to make sure that in November that every vote really does count.
Chris, can I jump in for a very quick thing and just say, I just want to echo that in terms of there are so many different reforms that we could do to advance our democracy, because it's not about bringing our democracy back to some point in American history where it was better. We have to take our democracy to a place where it's never been, because our democracy has never been particularly great. And so I think things like ranked choice voting, which I'm fully supportive of, there's going to be a ballot initiative in Maine or in Massachusetts and Alaska in this upcoming election. Voting rights, mail-in ballots, no excuse absentee balloting, but things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, ending felon disenfranchisement, limiting voter purges. I mean, the list goes on, and of course, ending gerrymandering. But the point I actually wanted to make here was just these issues are so wildly popular that when they're on the ballot, they almost always pass. You saw it, the same election Donald Trump won in 2016, there were like 16 pro-democracy ballot initiatives that passed, or maybe it was 14 then. And then in 2018, there were over 20 that passed. And you see it in red states, in blue states, in purple states. You see it on money in politics and gerrymandering reform, in voting rights, on all of these issues when it comes to these process issues that have long been seen as boring, as a lawyer's issue, as a nerdy issue. Americans get that the system is fundamentally unfair and fundamentally unequal. And when they're given the chance to act, whether it's by lobbying their members of the state house, whether it's lobbying the federal government, whether it's passing ballot initiatives, Americans are rising to the challenge. And it's thanks to the work of groups like Common Cause, and there are so many amazing organizations like that working on in the fight for democracy reform, that I just wanted to put it out there that this is not something that we have to do, we do have to do educating on, but people do get it, that these are winning issues. And candidates don't have to avoid running on this, but you see candidates now running on these issues like public financing or voting rights or gerrymandering reform, whereas, 3 years ago, let alone 5, 10 years ago, that would have been seen as political kind of suicide. Why are you wasting your time on these issues?
Well, it's that I have seen this stat reported a couple times where it's over 80% of people, not just Democrats, Republicans, independent, unaffiliated, it's 80% of Americans feel that money in politics has too much influence over their government in the way that, and if you're talking about Assemblyman Zwicker, as you were saying, having people feel like they're invested in their government. Beth, you alluded to this too. Adam, everyone's kind of said this in one way or another. It's that feeling like their government is their own, and that when they step into that voting booth or they put their ballot in the mail, they know that their voice is actually being heard and they're participating in the direction that their society is taking. And I think that once, and Adam, in your book, you call it kind of like the movement of movements, and this sort of emotional gratification that you get from being with like-minded people and working towards these goals. That is kind of a microcosm of this greater emotional sense that when you vote and you have your representatives represent yourself and your interests and the interests of society in general, you get that sort of feeling like, yeah, this is my government, and I'm proud to cast this vote, rather than just being like, oh, it's election day, or even worse, you don't even know that it's election day, and you wonder why these millions of signs are out all along your drive to work, So that having been said, guys, I just want to thank you so much. I'm sorry we didn't get to really any of the Q&A. It was such a great discussion. I want to let all you guys go. We've been at this for over an hour now. Thank you so much for joining us, all three of you. Adam, how can we follow your work? And once again, this is the book that everybody needs to buy right here.
I appreciate that. You're a better flack than I am. I'm not very good at self-promotion. You can follow, best way to do it is via Twitter, because that's really all I do anymore, at Adam Eichen, just my name. But you can also check out work with Equal Citizens. It's equalcitizens.us. And I also am working with another nonprofit called Democracy Policy Center, where we're working to expose some corporate influence in Washington, D.C.
And you have a piece coming out soon, right? You were telling me about that we should look out for?
Yes, tomorrow I'll be publishing a piece that is related to police union spending and super PACs. So maybe I'll have you send that around.
Where's that going to be published?
In the Appeal. It'll be pretty it'll be pretty spicy.
Oh, excellent. All right, looking forward to it. Beth Rotman, how can we follow your work over at Common Cause and everything that you're doing?
Well, I think the best way is to get involved in your state. We have state chapters in 35 states, and if you don't have one in your state, get involved with us nationally. We're helping our members connect to the moment and get involved as activists on the ground to really bring meaning to we the people, because this is our democracy, and this is a time for everybody to be involved. We need you.
And how can we specifically follow Common Cause?
Okay, and so www.commoncause.org is the best way to get us.
Excellent.
Come to our webpage.
Assemblyman Zwicker, how can we all join in on your next campaign and make sure we send you back to Trenton?
Well, for now, I'm not up for an election until next year, for now, you can, like everybody else, I'll plug my website is www.andrewzwicker.com, and my Twitter feed is @Andrew Zwicker. Feel free to direct message me, sign up for my newsletter, send me an email. You can find all of my various ways to get in touch. And I think this is an important question, because it's not just about how do you get in touch with us, but how do you become part of the change? And that's really it right there. Because Chris, what you just said, I just want to echo. When people get involved, feel involved, are part of the change, right? It makes all the difference in the world. And so thank you for bringing us together and having this discussion.
It's absolutely my pleasure to have you guys. Thank you once again to Adam Eichen, Beth Rotman, Assemblyman Andrew Zwicker, our producer Jim Lavranchuk, our moderators Erin Norbury and Didier Menez. I think that what we can all take away from our discussion tonight, once again, is that democracy is not a destination, it's a journey. And the most important steps on that journey have to be taken through our communities themselves. Many of you in the audience tuning in tonight are already politically active in various organizations. Many are looking to take your first steps in the movement. But the point is that when we do move together, we will find that there is truly nothing that we can't accomplish. So let's bring the movement for clean money elections to our own towns. Let's show how it can be done so that other towns join in our footsteps. There's so much at stake, and only a thriving and healthy democracy of, by, and for we the people is going to see us through it. When we save democracy, we will save the world. I promise you that. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.